So, well, the first question is usually how we usually ask how you meet Ed Roberts, but I think we both know the answer.
No, I want to answer that. That
Sure.
first question. How did I meet Ed Roberts? Well, I went to Mills Memorial Hospital on November 24th, and in great labor and a long night, something little popped out of me, and we named it Ed, and that was Ed Roberts.
What role did Ed play in your life? And how did he influence you?
How did Ed influence my life?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, he was my first kid to be born to me. So I took him home and I thought, what am I going to do with it? But I talked to him about it, and we kind of made an agreement that he'd do his part and I'd do my part. And that's what we did. Yes. And he influenced where I lived, how I lived, and with his father, my husband, until his brother came along a couple of years later, and then things changed a little bit. But he influenced my life all through my life, in many ways.
Yeah. So describe your impressions of Ed. What was he like as a child?
He was very, very inquisitive. He was getting into everything. He was to have him go to sleep, I had to get a little harness to put on him and pin down in his crib. He could roll around in it, but he couldn't get up and run around, at least for a while. So it was hard to pin him down, because he'd rather be outside with a hammer and nails and taking down the back porch or something, which he tried to do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was very inquisitive.
Yeah.
Playing sports.
Yeah, I hear he was a star football player, if I'm right, a baseball player.
He wanted to be a baseball player. He sure did. He enjoyed baseball.
Yeah.
I think it's a little boring myself, but he loved it. That would have been his sport. And then later he wanted to be a Marine. That was when the days of the Marines that were the heroes, I guess, of the world. So they were all physical kind of things. They weren't particularly. He wasn't into cooking and sewing and embroidery and painting and such. No, he liked playing and running around, organizing games.
So what was Ed's legacy more broadly?
What was his legacy on me?
Just what? In general, what did he leave behind, you think?
Well, it depends on where he was and where his hammer was. If he was tearing something down, it was his legacy now after all his life.
Yeah, sure. What's that there?
Well, he seems to have left quite a trail behind him of things that he persevered. And for Ed, it was all because we're getting into after polio now. First, we're talking about him as a baby and as a young man. And now when he was 14 and had gotten very tall, he wasn't very interested in school, except at school on the playground where the kids were. And one of the teachers said, you sit him in the classroom and he looks kind of bored, but you get him out on that playground and he's rounding up the kids and they're playing games and he's just the life of the party. So that was his legacy at school and stuff. The legacy left on the world, I think, is in lots of countries around the world, his name is known, which, kind of surprising, but that's the way it is.
How do you feel about that, being his mother-in-law?
Oh, very proud if it's a good thing he did. I'm not very proud if it wasn't a good thing he did.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Uh-huh. But mostly he was doing good things. But it took him a long time to learn how to become an advocate for disability, because first of all, he had to come to appreciate the fact that his disability was something that was going to be with him. He had to live with it. He had to accept it. And it took him quite a while to realize that he had to lie there in the iron lung, and he couldn't play baseball and he couldn't get up and jump around. So what was he going to do? So he learned to read and just do a bang up job. And then by the time he went to junior college, when he was graduating from College of San Mateo, why the poli-sci professor said that Ed was the best poli-sci student he'd ever had. So he was beginning to make his way little by little by little to accept the fact of his disability, and that he had other things he could get interested in, and then soon turned to politics.
So you mentioned, what was he like in his college years, having to make that adjustment? Because I believe he was 14 at the time when he got polio, if I'm not mistaken.
Was he what?
I believe he was a teenager at the time when he got polio.
He was 14 years old when he got polio. Yeah. That was a big shock to the whole family and everybody. It was, those were the days when we all feared polio and everything. And when Ed was sick, that was not one of the things I thought was happening to him. It didn't occur to me till the doctor came and said, we better take him to the hospital and get him in. And we did. He walked into.
What was that transition like for him from kind of being the life of the party, as you say, and the star athlete, to now being iron lung?
How about depression? He was depressed. Yes. What would life be like for him if he couldn't do all the things that he enjoyed doing? And I know one time I read an article to him in the paper that I read about some people with disabilities doing some things, and Ed said, I don't want to hear about this. I don't want to hear about those people. And I said, okay. So it took him a while to come from the fact that he indeed had a disability. He was going to live with it, and what was he going to do about it? And that was up to him. So he got with it.
I'm going to go, my dear.
Okay.
Goodbye. Sounds great.
Thank you. Okay.
So what was Ed like as a young activist?
As a young activist?
Yeah.
Well, about what age? It's when he was in high school, or when he was in junior college, or when he was at Berkeley?
All of the above?
Well, first of all, he was finding his way. He did not want to go to Burlingame High School to be seen, because when he got polio, he had been playing games with his next Ron. Ron was 2 years younger. And he'd been playing sports with his friends and Ron's friends. And to go to high school and have these kids see him now as, pretty immobilized, he didn't want to be seen that way. So it took him a while, as one of his brothers was pushing him up Burlingame Avenue one time, and a kid came up and said, "What's the matter with you?" And Ed didn't know what to say. And then he finally had to figure out what to say of what was the matter with him. And little by little, so it was those kind of steps along the way that pushed his nose into the fact that this is what he was. And then when he was ready to graduate from Burlingame High School, I wanted him to go to the school once a week, at least to appear in a class. Otherwise, he took the classes with a homeschool teacher or over a box that sat on the edge of his bed, where he could hear the classes and they could hear him when he talked. So it was a distance thing. But for him personally, have to be there and be seen by these same group of kids that were his friends and Ron's friends was a terror. It was just scared him. But I kind of saw to it that he did that. And when he got there, Ron was there at high school still. Ron was just graduating. It was 2 years after Ed would have been graduating. So then Ron had some pretty girls around and they surrounded him and pushed him around, and he kind of got to like it.
So he was distance learning before it became a thing.
He was what?
He was distance learning before it became a thing that we all had to do. Because now we're in the middle of a pandemic, wherein everybody's remote learning and learning online. And
Yeah.
so he was doing that before everyone else.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that was his condition. So, but he got into the reading and he got into the understanding and to learning what he had to learn and enjoying it, as a matter of fact. So that was a good thing, because it got him into from high school graduation into junior college, and meeting our friend Jean Worth, who was teaching at College of San Mateo, who became a good friend to me and to the family and to Ed. And she was very influential on our lives. She would go fishing with my husband, and she was just a great lady. Cal graduate, or Mills College graduate, and a Cal graduate, and she was teaching a class in English literature. So when I drove Ed out to College of San Mateo for some classes there, she was one of his professors in the English department, and Jean and I became friends. And I invited her to house for lunch one day, and it was kind of a funny story about this, because she was coming to Burlingame to a student's house for lunch, and she wondered whether she should wear her hat and her gloves. And when Jean came to the house for lunch, one of my friends had gone into the hospital for some reason, so I had her kids there. The living room was full of bicycles, and I had Ed in a lounge chair out in the backyard, and I had made blintzes for lunch, and Jean finally realized that a hat and gloves were not the proper apparel for there. Her jeans and boots were probably better. Anyway, we became very good friends, and she was, yes, she was the one that suggested Ed should go to Berkeley, UC Berkeley. Yeah.
So you say she was like a mentor figure in his life, kind of?
She was. Yeah. Jean Worth. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Finally, she started her own college, and later Ed was teaching a class at her college. And Mark Roberts, my number 3 son, was the first graduate of Jean Worth's Common College. And Randy, my number 4 son, went there for a while too. Randy wanted to be an architect, but he was killed in the meantime and didn't get a chance to do that. But Mark, that was a waypoint for him, and it made all different friends. And Ron was, Mark, who am I talking? I'm talking about Ed. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Ed got to Berkeley, and it proved to be a very good place for him to be. There was lots of activity going on there, and he was part of that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, can you? Is there a story of Ed that kind of gives me an idea of who he was?
The what?
Can you give a story of Ed that kind of gives you an idea of who he was as a person?
Yeah, he was very involved with people and what they were doing and how they were doing it and why they were doing it and what they were doing. Very, very inquisitive and curious. The things he was interested in, and of course he was still very interested in sports, and it was a good thing that my husband was interested in sports too, and it was a good thing there was television that in his bedroom at the house, which had been a dining room place where the Iron Lung was, they could watch sports together and talk about them. And Ed had this amazing ability. If a film was being made and there showed a sports team on the team, Ed knew which team that was. The team wasn't identified by any signal or something, but Ed said, "Oh, I know that team. That they played at such and such a college." And I thought, "How do you know that?" But he knew who the players were, and he followed sports, and then he followed politics and people and what they were doing. And he was very into that and getting interested in local politics. That was good.
So did you ever realize that he kind of would have the impact he did on the disability community? And when was that, if you know?
Well, the first time I knew about that was a time that there was a Ginny Laurie who ran a magazine for something kind of a thing for post-polios. And she had gotten in touch with us and gotten in touch with Ed and was writing articles about him and invited us to St. Louis, where her headquarters was, for a conference that she had a lot of post-polios coming there. So we went there, and I was watching the television screen, and she had people talking on the screen. And one young woman said that she was in the hospital, and the next day she was supposed to be transferred to a nursing home, and she couldn't go home for some reason or other. And she was accepting that she would be going to a nursing home kind of a place. And she listened to the 60 Minutes thing that they did about Ed. And I was in it, and Ed talked about how important it was to be independent. And independence was a very strong word in my vocabulary. I wanted Ed to be as independent as he could. I never stood in front of Ed, and if it was Ed's pain, he had to feel his pain. His happiness, he had to feel it. I didn't want to get in between that and whatever kind of life he was having. I would be happy to support him, but not take over any of those things for him. And so here was this young woman talking about that, and she said she watched 60 Minutes, and she watched this man called Ed Roberts, who talked about independence and that you could have your own life with a severe disability. And that one of the good things about Ed's severe disability was it got him noticed, where if he'd had a broken arm or leg or something, I think it would have been paid attention to, but not to the extent being paralyzed neck down got a lot of attention that way. What do you do then? And as many people would meet him and things and saying, as Ed often said, he said people would say to him, I'd rather die than be like that. And Ed didn't feel that way about it. He thought there was lots to live for, and he could fall in love, and he could take his classes, and he could meet people, and he could play chess, and he could do lots of things. And he enjoyed it. But when I heard this young woman say that she told the ambulance to go away, she was not going to the nursing home, she was going to find a way to live independently. And that's I sat up straighter in the chair, and I thought, holy moly, look at that influence he has. And it was through the 60 Minutes thing, yes, but it was his persona that came out there that said, you can do it. I can do it. You can do it. It's important. And she did. And she was so grateful and so happy about that. That's when I first knew that this was before our house, Berkeley, California, and across the United States. Message was getting sent, and some people were receiving it. And I thought, that's great. Yeah.
Were you ever surprised by the fact that it was like you were in St. Louis at the time? Here you weren't like seeing the impact that your son had made just by a 60 Minutes documentary.
Oh yes, very surprised. I knew he was I knew he was smart. Well, I knew he was smart from the time shortly after he was born. Knew he was smart, but it certainly didn't show up in school, particularly unless he was on the playground. And then by the time he got to junior college, it began to express itself in studies. And then at Berkeley, the same thing. It expressed itself in what he was doing, and then gathering people around him, other people with disabilities. He was the first one with a severe disability to live on campus. And then they took another person in, John Hessler, and after that, some other people, and then they formed their own group. So they began to be a force together with all kinds of disabilities, and that formed the Rolling Quads, which became a force of its own. So little by little by little, that was expanding across the neighborhood and then across the. But then later I realized I had trips to Japan with Ed because the Japanese government, some rehab thing, invited us. And then I had trips to to France with Ed, receiving an honor in France. And I went along with him. So that was pretty good. I thought, yeah, well, he was getting noticed all over. It was surprising. Yeah.
Yeah. So you guys kind of got to see the world in a way because of his notoriety.
Exactly. Yes. And I had always, before Ed was born, I hadn't been to college and I hadn't traveled. And after Ed had polio, I thought, I'm never going to be able to leave the house, much less travel and go to college. And then sort of through him or with him, I got to do those things. And he went his way and I went my way, but we met in between and traveled together sometimes. That was good. And he came home for holidays and stuff too. Yeah. He was a good kid. Yeah. Mostly a good kid.